All right. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Mia Hubler. I'm an associate professor for structural engineering and structural mechanics here in the Department of Civil, Environmental, and Architectural Engineering at CU Boulder. I also serve as the associate chair for faculty in our department, and I welcome all of you here today. This is our second alumni seminar. It's a new thing we're offering so that hopefully you can hear a little bit about the really impactful work that our faculty are doing right now. Today's seminar is going to be given by Ben Livneh, and I'm happy to introduce him. And so Ben is the director of the Western Water Assessment and is an associate professor in our department, as well as a fellow of the Corporate Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences that we refer to that as CEAE. His research group focuses on solving problems that explore how land cover and climate changes affect water availability across Western North America. And his recent projects have focused on changes in snowpack and drought prediction, as well as studying post-wildfire hydrology and water. And I believe that's what he's going to be sharing with you all today. All right. So I'm happy to stick around at the end of the talk. We have time for some questions for Ben. If you do have any questions about our department, always happy to share about that as well. And without further ado, I guess I can hand it over to you, Ben.
Thank you, Mia. And thanks for everybody who joined today. Maybe a few more will trickle in. We shall see. But yeah, it's really great to connect and to do this seminar, share some of the recent results that we've been finding in my research group. So yeah, maybe I will just well, Mia gave such a good background. I'll just say briefly, yes, I'm an associate professor here in the department. And before that, I was in at the University of Washington, which is in also in the Western US. But before that, I actually grew up in Canada and I got my first two degrees there. So that's kind of the professional side. And when I'm not working, I enjoy playing Go and spending time with my sons and my new dog, which you see there. Um, so I am a physical hydrologist, right? And there's my research group, and I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge them in this work. And yes, the Western Water Assessment also kind of plays a role in some of this as we're trying to make usable water and hazard science for decision making. And so, one more acknowledgement before I get started is Dr. Carly Brucker, who was the PhD student that led this work. She is now a staff professional engineer at Carollo Engineers on the Front Range. And she was co-advised actually by Fernando Rosario Ortiz, who's also a professor in our department. Okay, so for today, what I want to talk about are kind of three things. Okay, so I'll try to start with the motivation, and then I'll say just a little bit about this laboratory scale analysis that we did. And then I'll probably say spend most of my time on the Vason scale analysis. And so, um, motivation. Okay, so I think there's been a growing awareness of increasing wildfires in a warming world, right? So I've got data here from the Western United States. This is kind of an older graphic, but I think it shows that even, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we were already starting to see an uptick in the average frequency, so the kind of the count of fires, number of fires, and the increase in the amount of area that was burned. And if we look at just Colorado, you can see that, and this again is older, but it's a little more recent, that there has also been an upward trend in the area burned. And in particular, the year 2020 jumps out as this really big fire year. And we were kind of motivated by and really starting this work around 2020 when a lot of this stuff was happening. And so if we think about this year 2020 for a minute, what was happening at this time? There were these huge fires in Australia you may have heard about. Here in Colorado, we had our biggest fire. And of course, in California, they had, if you look at all of the fire years from 2021 and earlier, that more than half of the fire burned area, I believe, was from just those past 2 years. So we were really kind of feeling this motivation. And another thing to, of course, pay attention to in Colorado is we actually sometimes get the smoke from the California wildfires. So we not only have our own, but we have some of these after effects. Yeah, and so a little bit more about the motivation. So here are some of the ways in which fire affects water quality. So it affects runoff, and within that, the responses to that are both at the level of the built environment, kind of the water treatment plant and the reservoirs, which can fill with sediment, but also freshwater resources. There can be nutrification or eutrophication, sorry, due to nutrients and so on. So there's multiple dimensions to this that I think are worth paying attention to. Um, the first thing is, we can have enhanced flooding and greater transport of water quality constituents. And rather than me kind of just telling this to you, I think seeing it. So here's an example of a fire that happened in Arizona, the Bighorn Fire, also in 2020, that washed a great amount of transported a great amount of debris and, of course, water quality constituents down the river. So that's a really dramatic, and it's looping here so you can see also kind of just a safety hazard as well that you can see there. Uh, and so with that, we can think about some of these other things that are included in that sort of slurry of of materials. There are impacts going to be downstream, of course, on infrastructure. And then when we treat the water, we have to pay special attention to avoid, with the dissolved organic carbon and other constituents, these carcinogenic disinfectant byproducts, fish kills and algal blooms, and then just overall exceedance of health hazards. And so, given all of this, one would think that we would have a very good grasp of how wildfires affect water quality, and yet we have a limited understanding. And this is due to a few factors. One is just the scarcity of data. You never know where and when a fire is going to break out, so it's difficult to anticipate and to take observations. For that reason, we may have a lack of pre-burn data. So maybe you go and start monitoring once the fire has happened, but you would not have pre-fire data. There's a lot of natural variability, and then just simply there can be a lack of accessibility as we move to some of these slopes or these burned landscapes. Okay, so that's kind of the motivation. And now moving on to the lab scale analysis, we'll see. I think I can get through all of this in the time. So I'll tell you a little bit more about what we did. And we actually have a nice manuscript that came out now, what is it, 2 years ago? Gosh, the time is flying, where we looked at this, the role of wildfire on water quality in the lab. And the question we really wanted to answer here is how much is post-fire water quality changed by the severity of the fire itself versus the rainfall intensity that followed the fire, or perhaps the slope or the terrain in general of the sort of um, landscape. So to accomplish this, what we did was we conducted a laboratory scale investigation, and we tried to analyze each of these dimensions independently and in combination. So we can think about this with a Rubik's Cube. If you imagine that each of these dimensions, if you will, rainfall intensity, burn intensity, and terrain slope, are all likely to play a role. And so we wanted to evaluate each of them at different intervals or increments, and then monitor the hydrologic and water quality response for each of those combinations. And so you can think about this as like 3 dimensions. And the goal is really to evaluate each of these in turn, fire, rainfall intensity, and terrain slope. And for each increment, we tried to do two to four, or for each dimension, we tried to do 2 to 4 increments. Sorry. And at each increment, we tried to do 8 replicate soil samples. And that would let us observe responses in the hydrology, so the amount of runoff and infiltration, but also the water quality. So this took place over a couple of years, actually, a couple of summers, and there were 4 steps that we took. The first was field sampling of soils, then burn simulation using actually high-powered heat lamps, and then rainfall simulation, and then analysis of the water quality. And so I'll just briefly touch on each of these, but um, we had the pleasure of working with undergraduate students as well as graduate students, and even community college students for this, which was kind of fun. And so we did field sampling at the Fraser Experimental Forest here in Colorado, which is close to the Williams Fork Fire that happened, no surprise, in 2020, actually, which is shown here. And here's one of our brave undergraduate um, students that worked with us on this, and you can see in the back of the truck are all these soil samples, which we then brought to the lab, and we tested them. We applied kind of different heat levels of heat for different severity of fire using heat lamps. We were asked by sort of the fire marshal to do this outside and not inside, which I think is probably a good idea. And we use thermocouples to monitor the time temperature curve. So how hot was the surface getting? How hot was it getting under the surface? And it turns out that soil is an excellent insulator and that only a few centimeters below the surface, the temperature was much, much cooler. And so what we really applied were these surface fires, and we reached upwards of 500 degrees Celsius for our most severe fires. Then we used this rainfall simulator that Carly designed, where we'd put our soil samples in these custom funnels to collect runoff, but also infiltration. And this let us, with the simulator, simulate storm intensities of, let's say, a 10-year storm or a 20-year storm and so on. And we use those in our experiments. And lastly, we did analysis of water quality, which is shown here. So super briefly, I will tell you a bit about our results that we got. So we analyzed, there's a vast number of different combinations of these. If you think back to the Rubik's Cube, um, a vast combination. So I'll explain kind of how to read these graphs. So on the horizontal axis, we have the burn intensity. So we had anywhere from unburned all the way up to a mild, moderate, and severe burn. So that's what that is. The vertical, different groupings of these boxes are the medium and high rainfall intensity. Okay. And then the 2 sets of plots on the left and right in each group are a slightly flatter and a slightly steeper slope that we were able to adjust with the rack in our rainfall simulator. So I won't get into all of the results because there really are so many of them, but I will say that we generally saw relationships that were consistent with previous literature. A few interesting things, however, were um, first, that runoff generally increases with increasing fire severity. So what I'm showing here on the horizontal axis is time, and then on the vertical axis, we've got the amount of runoff, surface runoff, normalized by the precipitation. So we call this the runoff ratio. And you can see that for the severe, we had the most runoff normalized and going down to generally the unburned, although things got kind of noisy later in the experiment. Um, Sediment and turbidity also increased with increasing fire severity. So you generally suspended sediment concentration here and turbidity. You can see those are increasing with increasing fire severity like that. The one thing that may be counterintuitive to some folks is the dissolved constituents. And actually, these showed kind of a middle peaked relationship. So I've got DOC and total dissolved nitrogen. And you can see kind of a peak in the middle. So the horizontal axis here is the temperature that we elevated the soils to. And you can see that actually the highest values tended to be near the middle. And I think this is actually somewhat common in this type of analysis where at the very highest temperatures, um, you end up volatilizing a lot of constituents. And whereas at the lowest temperatures, you don't really transport them very well. And therefore, it's the middle temperatures, the moderate severity fires that are produce the most impact. And so to kind of summarize for this part of the presentation, in the lab, we showed that um, burn and rainfall intensity uh, affect increase runoff and sedimentation with more severe burns, significantly impacting these outcomes. Water quality response patterns had more of a middle peaked relationship, which was, I guess, consistent with some of the previous literature, but is a little bit counterintuitive, perhaps. And then something I didn't say almost anything about were some of the limitations. It turns out that the way we transported our samples, in particular for the burning, I showed you that we had to do it outside. The cart that we used to transport those samples actually seems to have disturbed them quite a bit due to the vibration and so on, so that actually the some of the sediment and other things may have been lost along the way. And I didn't show completely, but in some cases, the unburned samples actually had greater availability of these constituents. And so that's something for sediment and for turbidity that we reported in our paper. So I hope you'll check that out or feel free to ask questions at the end. Okay, so moving from the lab scale now to the larger scale, since it turns out that nearly all of the sort of impacts that we care about are at these larger scales. We wanted to kind of first understand the lab scale, but now transition to the basin scale, where we recently had this paper just came out like a few months back in the end of last year, where we looked at post-wildfire water quality across large parts of the Western United States. The question here that we were asking was, are post-fire water quality changes detectable at the basin scale, right? And so basin scale modeling of post-burn water quality can, of course, help planning in a number of ways. At the short term, that could be related to burn site mitigation efforts. And at the longer term, this would be investments in infrastructure, um, upgrades, retrofitting, etc., to allow more flexibility in the system. And yet, kind of similar to in the previous section, there really have been a lack of good modeling efforts at this scale for some of the same reasons as before, lack of pre-fire data, spatial and temporal heterogeneity, and resolution. And so what we wanted to do here was we wanted to use a data-driven modeling approach to try to optimize for this a little bit. So we essentially created a wildfire-affected water quality database across the West. And then for each location where we had pre-fire data, pre-fire water quality data, and post-fire, we built these data-driven models to try to quantify the impact of fire. And then the last step was to look across different watersheds and try to understand why some watersheds may be producing larger responses and what is it about those watersheds. We use this term physiographic variables, like perhaps the amount of forest or the terrain slope or the area or something could tell us and give us clues as to where future um, fires could be more impactful, let's say. Okay, so a bit about our methods. So we used a combination of in situ and satellite data, as well as I believe some modeled data sets or reanalysis type data sets to do this. So for our kind of predictor variables, our driving variables, we had streamflow and discharge. And then for the which we got from these sources here, mostly the USGS. And then we got climatic data from the era 5 reanalysis. We also characterized fire and land cover and terrain using these different data sets here. And then finally, our target variables, the water quality, came from mostly the water quality portal, which I'll talk about in a sec. So we use these bottom ones here to make data-driven model building, and then intersite variability was characterized with some of these variables here. So I won't say too much about the data, although it is important to note a couple of things. First is where we got our water quality data. I think it was almost entirely from this water quality portal, which is shown here, and gave us data back to 1974. And then characterizing the fires, the burn severity was from this MTBS data set. Okay, so to start, what we did was it turned out that we could find a lot of water quality data at locations that may not have um, a river basin delineated. And for that reason, we needed to first custom delineate our watershed and then try to estimate runoff and other things over that area. So the custom delineation allowed us to therefore greatly increase the number of data points that we could use because now we could take water quality measurements from places where we may not have discharge, et cetera, and try to estimate it and estimate the drainage area where there may have been a fire. So I'll walk you through this briefly. So for the Western United States, we began with a vast number of basins. These outlines are for almost 50,000 basins that we delineated. And within there were 11,000 plus wildfires. Now, if we wanted to just subset the burned basins, then that reduced down to a smaller number of watersheds, maybe about a quarter or a third. And we set some constraints, right? We wanted for a basin to be considered burned, at least 5% of the area had been burned. And then if we wanted high quality data with at least 10 data points pre, 10 data points post fire, at least 3 years of observations pre and post fire, then that reduced our number of basins way down, almost another order of magnitude to 330 of them. And then we wanted to use this classic technique in hydrology of paired watersheds. And so we wanted to find nearby watersheds, watersheds that were near the burned watersheds, but ones that hadn't been burned. And we could use these as a kind of control. Um, and these had less than, what would that be, 1/20th of a percent burned area, so largely unburned. And across all of these, we wanted to have mostly undeveloped, so less than 5% developed, and at least a quarter of the basin was forested because it was kind of forest fires that we're interested in. Okay, so given all of that, we ended up with this data set and the types of water quality observations that we were able to collate looked something like this. So I'm showing here all of our burned basins colored by the constituent that we had the most observations for. That isn't to say the only observations, but the most. And if you aggregate across all the watersheds, what you find is a pretty big distribution, but that many of them are for sediment and carbon, which are the brown and purple, and then a smaller, or sorry, brown and blue. The purple is also sediment as well in there, I believe. And so we had a wide range of things. And the way we tried to then characterize what was the impact of the fire was using a causal inference technique that I'm going to show here. So basically what we did is we did two things. First, we trained a linear model on the pre-fire data, right? And we used the hydroclimatic variables, things like precipitation and temperature, as predictors here. And then we fit coefficients to estimate our pre-fire model. Okay. And then when we ran the thing post-fire, we compared the difference between the pre-fire and the post-fire water quality and call that difference the effect. The second thing we did is we fit the same models for the nearby paired unburned basins to also try to characterize, well, what was the kind of effect of the natural variability in weather patterns and so on at that time. And then we aggregated all of our results across models and looked at the years pre-fire and post-fire, which is what I'm going to show you. I'm just going to touch on a few of the kind of high-level results. So, yeah, when we aggregate our model behavior across basins, what I've done here is the way to read these is for each of these each one is a different water quality constituent. We've aligned all of the basins by the year of the fire, which is shown in uh, this dark gray bar. And then two things to show here. So when we train our model on pre-fire years, which is the light blue, these horizontal dashed lines represent what the model would have predicted if we ran, if there wasn't a fire there. So for the years after the fire, these orange bars, when those poke above the blue uh, lines, that suggests a significant result. Also, these gray shading areas are what was happening with the water quality in the unburned basins. So to be more conservative, you could say that anytime these orange bars fall above both the blue and the gray, we are pretty confident that that's a statistically significant increase caused by the fire. And you can see for different constituents, you had different degrees of or different durations of severity. But in general, most of them were significant for 2 years past the fire. But we looked at 12 of these, and some of them were persistent even to 8 years past the fire. Like you can see, nitrate is one that has a long persistence. So that was somewhat surprising that the duration of the impact was so long. Finally, what we tried to do was we tried to relate our findings to basin characteristics. And if you remember at the beginning of this, I was saying, what might explain why one basin produces more of a water quality response after a fire than another one. And so we tried to do this kind of simple correlation analysis between the amount of change in these different constituents on the horizontal here, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and so on, and the different basin characteristics. Anywhere that the numbers are bolded, that is a statistically significant correlation. And you can see that one of the most significant predictors was just the percentage of the basin that was forested. And I think this makes a lot of sense. We also looked at the distance between the fire location and the outlet of the basin, which was also significant in a number of places. We didn't go super deep into this, but it does seem like a an interesting area for further exploration, to be sure. So with that, I realized that it was a tremendous amount of information. And so what I will do is I think I'm going to summarize and then stop so I can get some questions or hear some feedback. What I would say from the basin scale analysis is that we could see multi-year impacts, wildfires leading to substantial increases in water contaminants with sediment and nitrogen levels remaining elevated for up to 8 years, which was I would say this was the most surprising thing of this whole study, was that it's not just the year of the fire or the year after the fire, but you can have this significant footprint, let's say, of the fire for up to 8 years, which is really a long time. And that we showed that there are potentially connections to landscape characteristics like the amount of forest in the watershed, the proximity of the fire to the outlet, and so on. So now there is a data set of all that I've shown you that is public. There's also a paper that was, as I said, published last year in one of the nature journals, which is great. And so with that, I will conclude and take any questions. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Ben. Again, we're happy to hear any questions or comments.
Okay, we probably caught people during the lunch hour, as even I myself am eating. Perhaps people are also eating. So feel free to reach out, if you don't have any questions now. If this maybe reminds you of something that you're wanting to know or interested in, feel free to reach out, anytime. Happy to take uh, questions later if now is not ideal. Yeah.
Thank you, Rachel.
Okay.
All right. Well, I thank everyone for joining. And Thomas, if you do want to share any comments or questions, still happy to take those. I think we'll wrap it up here and invite you to join us for more of these seminars this fall. We should have a few more faculty lined up to share about other disciplines they're working in. Thanks again.
Thanks.